As Richard Montero stepped into the dimly lit living room of his childhood home, the sight before him froze him in place. His mother, Helen, was on her knees, scrubbing the carpet with raw, reddened hands. The vibrant woman he remembered was now a shadow of herself, her eyes dull and her shoulders trembling with exhaustion. "Mom?" His voice cracked, but it was the only sound in the suffocating silence. Helen looked up, startled, and tried to force a smile through tears. "Richard, what are you doing here?" Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any exciting stories like this one. Here, each video is a journey of overcoming and emotion that you won't want to miss. Richard Montero parked his sleek black car a block away from the modest house where he had spent his childhood. For a moment, he sat in silence, gripping the steering wheel as memories washed over him. The laughter of his mother, Helen, her warm embrace, and the unmistakable aroma of her homemade meals seemed to fill the air again. But those memories were clouded by the shadow of his stepfather, Elias Vaughn, a man who had often made their lives unbearable. It had been almost a decade since Richard last set foot in that house. The ambitious 25-year-old who had left back then had transformed into a powerful 35-year-old business magnate, but the memories of the life he had left behind still haunted him. The years had flown by, yet the pain of that place had not. Gathering his courage, Richard stepped out of the car, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel of the old street. The house stood before him, weathered and worn, its faded paint and sagging porch a stark contrast to the grandeur of his current life. His heart pounded as he approached the front door. "Mom," he murmured to himself, imagining her surprise when she saw him. It had been years since their last phone call, a strained conversation filled with polite updates but no real connection. He had told himself he was too busy to visit, too focused on building his empire. But deep down, he knew it was because he had wanted to forget. The silence emanating from the house unsettled him. The cheerful chaos that once defined it seemed long gone. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. The seconds dragged into minutes with no answer. Frowning, he tried the knob. To his surprise, the door creaked open. "Mom?" he called out, stepping inside. The air was heavy, the once cozy interior now cold and dim. Dust covered the furniture, and the familiar warmth he remembered was replaced with an eerie emptiness. His eyes darted around, searching for any sign of life. And then he saw her. Kneeling on the floor in the middle of the living room was Helen, scrubbing at a stubborn stain on the carpet. Her once vibrant auburn hair was streaked with gray, and her hands, once soft and nurturing, were rough and red. She hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on her task. "Mom!" Richard's voice broke the silence. Helen startled, her head jerking up. Her tired eyes widened as they met his, and for a moment, there was only silence between them. Then a weak smile crossed her face. "Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" Richard dropped to his knees beside her, taking her hands in his. "I came to see you, Mom." "But, what is this? What's going on?" His voice was laced with concern. Helen quickly pulled her hands away, wiping them on her apron. "It's nothing, dear. Just cleaning up a bit. You know how Elias is about keeping things tidy." "Elias?" Richard repeated, his voice hardening. "Mom, why are you doing this? Where is he?" Helen averted her gaze, her smile faltering. "He's resting." "Richard, really, it's nothing to worry about." But Richard wasn't the same naive young man who had left years ago. He saw the fear in her eyes, the defeat in her posture. Something was very wrong. "Mom, tell me the truth," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "What's been happening here?" Helen hesitated, her hands trembling in her lap. Then, as if a dam had burst, tears began to stream down her face. Between sobs, she told him how Elias had changed after Richard left. He had grown cold and controlling, treating her more like a servant than a wife. The love that had once brought them together had dissolved into something toxic and cruel. Richard clenched his fists as he listened, his jaw tightening with every word. Guilt coursed through him like a river. He had left to escape Elias's shadow, but in doing so, he had abandoned his mother to suffer alone. "This ends today," he said, standing abruptly. His voice was filled with resolve. "I'm going to talk to him." "Richard, no!" Helen exclaimed, grabbing his arm. "Please, I don't want any trouble. I'm fine." "Really?" "You're not fine, Mom," he said, his voice softening as he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You deserve so much better than this." Before she could protest further, Richard strode down the hallway toward the study where he knew Elias spent most of his time. Each step felt heavier than the last as memories of the man's cruel words and dismissive demeanor resurfaced. But this time, Richard was no longer a helpless boy. He was a man, one with the power to change things. Reaching the door, he paused and took a deep breath. The confrontation ahead would change their lives forever, but Richard knew it was a battle worth fighting. He turned the knob and pushed the door open. The study smelled of stale cigars and whiskey, an oppressive reminder of Elias Vaughn's presence. Richard's eyes locked onto the man seated behind the large oak desk. Elias, now 60, had aged significantly. His graying hair was slicked back, and his bulkier frame seemed less intimidating than Richard remembered. Elias looked up from a newspaper, his eyes narrowing as recognition dawned. Well, he drawled, a smirk forming on his lips. "If it isn't the prodigal son, gracing us with his presence after all these years." Richard stepped inside, shutting the door firmly behind him. His posture was rigid, his jaw tight with restrained anger. "Elias," he said, his voice cold. "We need to talk." Elias leaned back in his chair, feigning indifference. "Talk? After nearly a decade of silence? What could you possibly have to say to me?" Richard approached the desk, placing his hands on its surface and leaning forward. "It's about my mother. How dare you treat her like a maid? I found her scrubbing the floor, crying." "Crying, Elias." Elias snorted, waving his hand dismissively. "Helen is fine. You're making something out of nothing. She likes to keep the house clean, her choice." "Don't lie to me," Richard snapped, his voice rising. "I can see what's happening. She's terrified of you." Elias's smirk faded, replaced by a hard glare. "Listen here, boy. You left this house. You left her. Don't come barging in, playing the hero now. Whatever happens here is none of your business." Richard's fists curled into tight balls. "Wrong. She's my mother, and her well-being is very much my business." Elias stood abruptly, towering over the desk. "And what are you going to do about it? You think you can just waltz in here and tell me how to run this house? You're a spoiled brat who abandoned his family the moment he got a taste of freedom." Richard's eyes burned with fury, but he kept his voice steady. "I left because of you. Because you made this place unbearable. I thought my mother would be safe. Clearly, I was wrong." Elias scoffed. "Safe? Do you know how much I've done to keep this house afloat? The sacrifices I've made? While you were out chasing your dreams, I was here, making sure she had a roof over her head." Richard's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. "And you repaid her by turning her into your servant. That ends now." Elias slammed his hand on the desk. "You think you can just dictate terms to me? This is my house. You have no right." Richard straightened, his expression hardening. "I have every right where my mother is concerned. And if you don't fix this, if you don't start treating her with respect, I'll make sure you regret it." Elias stepped out from behind the desk, his frame looming over Richard. "Careful, boy. You don't want to start something you can't finish. Richard didn't flinch, his confidence unshaken. I'm not a boy anymore, Elias. I have resources, connections, and the means to protect my mother. If you think you can bully me the way you've bullied her, you're mistaken. For a moment, the two men stood in tense silence, their standoff brimming with unspoken challenges. Then, the sound of the door creaking broke the moment. Both turned to see Helen standing in the doorway, her face pale with worry. "Richard, please," she said, her voice trembling. "Elias, this isn't the way." Elias took a step back, crossing his arms. "Your boy thinks he can threaten me, Helen." Helen's eyes filled with tears as she turned to Richard. "Richard, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this isn't your fight. I'll be fine. Just go, please." Richard's chest tightened at her words, the sight of her frail figure stirring a mixture of guilt and determination. "Mom, no," he said, his voice softening. "You deserve better than this." Helen shook her head, her shoulders sagging under the weight of years of pain and compromise. "It's not that simple." "Yes, it is," Richard said firmly. "I'm not leaving you here to suffer. You deserve peace, safety, and dignity, not this." Elias let out a bitter laugh. "And what? You're going to whisk her away to your fancy mansion and play savior?" Richard didn't answer him. Instead, he turned to Helen, his eyes pleading. "Come with me, Mom. You don't have to stay here anymore." Helen hesitated, her eyes darting between the two men. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't. Not yet." "Why not?" Richard asked, his frustration evident. "What's keeping you here?" Helen looked down, avoiding his gaze. "There are things you don't know, Richard. Things I can't explain right now." Richard's expression hardened. "Then I'll find out. And when I do, this ends." He stepped past her, pausing at the doorway. "Elias, consider this your warning. If I find out you've been lying or hiding anything, you'll regret it." Without another word, Richard walked out of the study, leaving Helen and Elias in silence. As he reached the front door, he clenched his fists, determination blazing in his eyes. Whatever secrets had kept his mother in that house, he was going to uncover them. The drive back to his penthouse was silent except for the rhythmic hum of the engine. Richard's mind raced with questions. What could Helen be hiding? Why was she so reluctant to leave? He thought of the fear in her eyes and the weight of her words. Something wasn't right, and he was determined to uncover the truth. As he entered his sleek, modern apartment, he immediately pulled out his phone and called his assistant, Jessica. "Jessica, I need you to look into something," he said, his voice curt. "I want a full background check on Elias Vaughn, financial records, property deeds, legal history, everything. And see if there's anything on a Charles Montero." "Charles Montero?" Jessica asked. "Your uncle?" "Yes," Richard replied, his tone sharp. "I have a bad feeling about him. Dig into anything suspicious." "Understood. I'll get back to you as soon as I find something." Richard ended the call and poured himself a drink, standing by the window overlooking the glittering cityscape. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't just about Elias. Helen's hesitation, her cryptic words, they hinted at something deeper. The next morning, his phone buzzed with a call from Jessica. Her tone was urgent. "You're going to want to see this. Can you come to the office?" "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Richard said, grabbing his coat. When Richard arrived, Jessica was waiting with a folder in hand. Her expression was grim. "What did you find?" he asked, sitting down in his office. Jessica placed the folder on the desk. "Elias Vaughn has been hiding a lot. Multiple loans in his name, most of them tied to your mother's house. He's deeply in debt, Richard. And it gets worse. Some of these documents show co-signatures. Your mother's name is on them. Richard's stomach churned as he opened the folder and scanned the documents. There it was, Helen Vaughn's signature on several loan agreements. She wouldn't have agreed to this, he said, his voice low with anger. He must have pressured her. Jessica nodded. That's what I thought too. But there's more. Charles Montero, your uncle, has been in contact with Elias for years. They've exchanged money and property documents, including some connected to your father's estate. Richard leaned back, his fists clenching. Charles and Elias, working together? It looks that way, Jessica confirmed. It seems they've been conspiring to take control of your family's assets. Richard's mind raced. His uncle had been a distant figure for most of his life, but now he saw the pattern. The resentment, the absence, Charles had likely been plotting this for years. I need to confront him, Richard said, his jaw tightening. Where is he now? Jessica hesitated. I tracked his most recent address. It's in the old city district. But, Richard, be careful. This isn't just about money. These men don't play fair. Richard nodded. Thank you, Jessica. Keep digging. I'll handle Charles. The old city district was a far cry from Richard's polished, modern world. Narrow streets wound through crumbling buildings, and the air was thick with the smell of damp concrete. Richard parked his car outside a weathered apartment building and climbed the creaking stairs to the third floor. The door was ajar. Cautiously, Richard pushed it open and stepped inside. Uncle Charles, he called out. A figure appeared in the dimly lit living room. Charles Montero was older, thinner than Richard remembered, but his sharp eyes betrayed no weakness. He smirked as he leaned against a battered table. Well, if it isn't the golden boy, Charles said. What brings you to this side of town? Richard didn't waste time on pleasantries. I know about you and Elias. The loans, the house, my father's estate. You've been conspiring against my mother for years. Charles's smirk faded slightly, but his voice remained composed. Big accusations, nephew. Got any proof? I do, Richard said, his tone icy. And I intend to use it. But first, you're going to tell me everything. Charles laughed dryly. And why would I do that? Because if you don't, Richard said, stepping closer, I'll make sure you and Elias go down for fraud and coercion. I have the resources to destroy you both. Charles's smirk twisted into a scowl. He pulled out a chair and sat, gesturing for Richard to do the same. Fine. You want the truth? Here it is. Richard remained standing, his eyes boring into his uncle. After your father died, I was left with nothing, Charles began. Everything went to your mother. I was supposed to get a share of the estate, but your father made sure that didn't happen. I deserved that money, Richard. It was my right. So you decided to steal it? Richard snapped. Not steal, Charles retorted. Reclaim. Elias came to me with an opportunity. He needed money to keep the house afloat, and I needed leverage to get what I was owed. We made a deal. Richard's chest tightened with rage. And my mother? Did she even know what she was signing? Charles shrugged. She didn't need to know. Elias handled that part. She's too soft, easy to manipulate. Richard took a deep breath, his hands trembling with anger. This ends now. You're going to sign over everything you've taken from her, every penny, every property. And then you're going to disappear. Charles smirked again, though his confidence wavered. And if I don't? Richard leaned in, his voice low and menacing. Then I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life paying for what you've done. I'll bury you, Charles. The tension in the room was electric. Charles stared at Richard, weighing his options, but the fear in his eyes was clear. "Fine," he said finally. "But Elias won't go quietly. He's more desperate than I am." "I'll deal with Elias," Richard said, turning on his heel. "Consider this your only chance, Charles. Don't test me." As he left the apartment, Richard felt a mix of satisfaction and fury. The puzzle was coming together, but the battle was far from over. Elias was still a threat, and Richard knew the worst was yet to come. The sun was setting as Richard parked his car outside his mother's house. The modest structure looked even more worn than before, the weight of Elias's neglect evident in every corner. Richard's mind was ablaze with thoughts of Charles's confession. If Charles had been truthful, Elias's actions were far more calculated and sinister than he had initially imagined. He stepped inside without knocking. "Mom," he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. Helen appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked tired, her shoulders hunched under an invisible weight. "Richard, you're back," she said softly. "What's going on?" Richard walked over and gently took her hands in his. "We need to talk. About Elias, about Charles, about everything." Her brow furrowed, and she pulled her hands away. "Richard, I told you before, it's complicated." "I know, Mom," he said, his tone firm yet kind. "But I've uncovered things you need to know. Please, sit down." Reluctantly, Helen sat on the worn couch, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. Richard sat beside her, his heart aching at the sight of her fragility. "Mom," he began carefully, "I spoke with Charles. He admitted everything. He and Elias have been conspiring for years. They've been using you, manipulating you." Helen's face paled. "Charles? Your uncle? What does he have to do with this?" Richard exhaled, trying to steady his emotions. After Dad died, Charles felt he was cheated out of his inheritance. He joined forces with Elias, and together, they've been working to take control of this house and Dad's assets. They used you to make it happen. Tears welled in Helen's eyes as she shook her head. "No. No, that can't be true. Elias said the loans were to help us, to keep us afloat." Richard reached into his bag and pulled out a folder, laying it gently on the coffee table. "These are the loan documents, Mom. Your signature is on them, but I know you didn't fully understand what you were signing. They've tied everything to this house. If Elias defaults, you could lose everything." Helen stared at the papers, her hands trembling. I didn't know," she whispered. "He told me it was for us, that it was the only way." Richard placed a hand on her shoulder. "Mom, listen to me. None of this is your fault. They took advantage of you, but we can fight back." Helen's tears began to flow freely, and she covered her face with her hands. "I trusted him. I thought he loved me." Richard's heart broke at her words, but his resolve only grew stronger. "Mom, love doesn't look like this. Love doesn't manipulate or control. You deserve better, and I promise you, we'll make this right." The next morning, Richard's phone buzzed with an alert. It was Jessica. "Richard, I found something else," she said, her voice tense. "It's about the house." "What is it?" he asked, already bracing himself. "There's another name tied to the property," Jessica explained. "It's not just Elias or your mother. Charles's name is on a partial deed." Richard's grip on the phone tightened. "How is that possible? It seems Charles had your mother sign over part ownership to him years ago. It's why he's so involved in all this. He's been working in the background to secure his stake." Richard cursed under his breath. "Thanks, Jessica. Keep digging." As he hung up, his thoughts raced. Charles's involvement was deeper than he had anticipated. He needed to confront Elias, directly and immediately. Later that afternoon, Richard stormed into the house, heading straight for the study. He found Elias sitting in his usual chair, a glass of whiskey in hand. "We need to talk," Richard said, his voice like steel. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Oh, back for round two? What now?" Richard threw the folder of documents onto the desk. "Explain this." Elias glanced at the papers, his expression hardening as he realized what they were. "Where did you get these?" he demanded. "Doesn't matter," Richard shot back. "What matters is the truth. You and Charles have been plotting to take everything from my mother." Elias leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "And if we have? What are you going to do about it?" Richard's hands slammed down on the desk, his anger boiling over. "You've crossed a line, Elias. You've used her, lied to her. It ends now." Elias stood, his smirk fading. "You think you can scare me, boy? I've spent years building this. You don't have the guts to take me down." Richard stepped closer, his voice dangerously low. "You're right. I'm not here to scare you, I'm here to destroy you. I've already got evidence of your fraud, your coercion. And Charles? He's just as guilty." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Elias's face. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he growled. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Richard countered. "And you're going to pay for every ounce of suffering you've caused her." At that moment, Helen appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. "Richard," she said softly, "it's time." Richard turned to her, his anger softening. "Time for what?" Helen stepped into the room, her gaze fixed on Elias. "Time to stop running. Time to face this head-on." That evening, Richard called Jessica. "It's time to bring the lawyers in," he said. "We're taking this to court." As the wheels began to turn for a legal battle, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that Elias and Charles weren't done fighting back. The stakes had just been raised, and the road ahead was filled with danger. But for Helen, for the truth, he was ready. The restaurant overlooking the lake was a picture of calm, an ironic setting for what was about to unfold. Richard arrived with Helen by his side, her hands trembling slightly as they walked toward the private terrace where Elias and Charles were waiting. Richard glanced at his mother, offering a reassuring smile. "Stay strong, Mom. This ends today." Helen nodded, though her expression betrayed her anxiety. "I'm ready, Richard. Let's do this." As they approached, Elias looked up from his seat, his smirk firmly in place. Charles sat beside him, his demeanor more guarded but no less defiant. "Look who decided to join us," Elias said mockingly, gesturing toward the empty chairs. "Please, sit. Let's have a civilized discussion." "We're here for answers, not pleasantries," Richard replied coldly, pulling out a chair for his mother before taking his own seat. Charles leaned forward, his tone dripping with false sincerity. "We've always been family, Richard. Surely we can resolve this without unnecessary drama." "Family?" Richard scoffed, glaring at his uncle. "You conspired with this man to steal from my mother. That's not family, it's betrayal." Elias interjected, his voice calm but laced with menace. "You're making this into something it's not, Richard. Your mother signed everything willingly. No one forced her hand." Helen, who had been silent until now, spoke up, her voice trembling but resolute. "I trusted you, Elias. You said it was for our future, for my protection. I didn't realize I was signing my life away." Charles feigned a look of regret. "Helen, we all made sacrifices. This wasn't personal. It was about survival." "Don't insult her intelligence," Richard snapped. "You manipulated her. Both of you. And now you'll face the consequences." Elias leaned back, his smirk returning. And what consequences would those be, Richard? You think you can just threaten us and walk away the victor? This isn't one of your business deals. No, Richard said, leaning forward. It's much simpler than that. He reached into his pocket and placed a small device on the table, a recording device. Every word you've said here has been recorded. And not just for my benefit. My legal team is listening to this conversation live. Both Elias and Charles stiffened, their expressions shifting from smugness to unease. You can't do that, Charles blurted. That's illegal. Richard smirked. We're in a public place, and I have every right to protect my mother from predators like you. Helen looked at the men who had caused her so much pain, tears pooling in her eyes but not spilling over. I never wanted it to come to this, but I won't let you take any more from me. It's over. Elias's composure finally cracked. You think you've won, boy? You don't know the lengths I'll go to. Richard stood, his towering presence commanding the room. Go ahead, Elias. Make your move. But let me remind you, I've already made mine. Charles fidgeted nervously. Let's be reasonable, Richard. We can negotiate, find a way to settle this quietly. Richard turned his icy gaze to his uncle. The time for negotiation is over. You'll return everything you stole, including your stake in the house. And if you don't, I'll make sure this case goes public. Your reputations, your finances, everything will crumble. Elias rose from his chair, his face red with fury. You ungrateful little. Enough. Helen interrupted, her voice ringing out with unexpected force. You've said enough, Elias. For years, I let you control me, make me feel powerless. But I'm done. Richard is right, this ends now. Elias froze, his mouth opening as if to argue, but no words came. Helen's unwavering gaze seemed to strip him of whatever power he thought he still held. Charles, sensing the tide had turned, slumped back in his chair. Fine, he muttered. You win. Richard turned to his mother. Mom, we're leaving. As he helped Helen to her feet, Elias spat one last venomous warning. This isn't over, Richard. You'll regret this. Richard didn't flinch. The only thing I regret is not doing this sooner. That evening, back at his penthouse, Richard sat with Helen on the couch, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. She looked exhausted but relieved. Do you think they'll follow through? She asked softly. They will, Richard assured her. But if they try anything, we're ready. The lawyers will take it from here. Helen nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. Thank you, Richard. For everything. Richard placed a hand over hers. You deserve peace, Mom. And I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you have it. As the city lights twinkled outside, mother and son sat in quiet companionship, knowing the battle wasn't fully over, but for the first time in years, there was hope. The courtroom was packed. Spectators whispered in hushed tones, the weight of the impending verdict palpable. Reporters sat poised with their notebooks, ready to capture every detail of the high-profile case. At the center of it all sat Helen and Richard Montero, side by side, their faces calm but resolute. Across the room, Elias Vaughn and Charles Montero fidgeted in their seats. Their smug confidence had eroded over the weeks of damning testimony and overwhelming evidence presented against them. Helen turned to Richard, her voice soft but steady. Whatever happens today, I want you to know I'm proud of you. Richard placed a reassuring hand over hers. We're not just fighting for you, Mom. We're fighting for Dad's legacy, and for the truth. The judge entered, bringing the room to order. The trial had been grueling, with Helen recounting years of manipulation and abuse, Richard presenting evidence of forged documents, and a surprise testimony from Charles's former assistant, who had exposed years of deceit. The judge cleared his throat, his expression unreadable. In the case of Helen Montero versus Elias Vaughn and Charles Montero, this court has reached a verdict. The room fell silent, every breath held in anticipation. After reviewing the evidence and hearing the testimonies, this court finds the defendants, Elias Vaughn and Charles Montero, guilty of fraud, coercion, and emotional damages. They are hereby ordered to relinquish all claims to the Montero estate and pay restitution to the plaintiff. A murmur swept through the courtroom as Helen's shoulders sagged with relief. Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched Richard's hand. "We did it," she whispered. The judge continued, "Additionally, this court recommends further investigation into possible criminal charges against the defendants for their actions." Richard glanced at Elias and Charles. Both men sat frozen, their faces pale. The weight of their downfall was apparent. As the courtroom began to empty, Richard stood and turned to the reporters gathered at the back. His voice was firm but composed. "Today's decision is more than a legal victory. It's proof that justice prevails, even against those who abuse power and trust. My mother's strength and courage have inspired me, and I hope her story inspires others to fight for what is right." That evening, Helen and Richard returned to the penthouse. The weight that had hung over them for years seemed to have lifted. As they sat in the living room, Richard poured 2 glasses of wine, handing one to his mother. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass. Helen smiled, her eyes still glistening with emotion. "To freedom." In the days that followed, Richard worked tirelessly to finalize the paperwork restoring full ownership of the family home to Helen. But instead of returning to it, Helen made a surprising decision. "I want to sell the house," she told Richard one morning over breakfast. "There are too many painful memories there." Richard nodded, understanding her sentiment. "We'll find a buyer. And the money can help fund whatever you want to do next." Helen's face brightened. "I've been thinking about starting a foundation. Something to help women like me, women who feel trapped and powerless. I want to give them the strength to fight back." Richard's chest swelled with pride. "That's a brilliant idea, Mom. I'll support you every step of the way." Weeks later, Helen's vision began to take shape. She named the foundation New Dawn, a beacon of hope for women facing abuse and manipulation. Richard threw his full weight behind the project, using his resources and connections to ensure its success. One evening, as they sat reviewing plans for the foundation's launch, a knock at the door interrupted them. When Richard opened it, he found a courier holding an envelope. "This is for you, Mr. Montero," the man said, handing it over. Richard closed the door and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter from Charles Montero, written from prison. Richard's jaw tightened as he read the words. "Dear Richard, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I need to explain myself. Losing my brother, your father, left me bitter and envious. I let that resentment consume me, and I made terrible choices. Prison has given me time to reflect, and I see now the damage I caused to you and Helen. I wish I could undo it, but I can't. All I can do is apologize and hope you'll believe that I am truly sorry. Take care of your mother. She's an incredible woman. And take care of yourself. Sincerely, Charles." Richard handed the letter to Helen, who read it silently. When she finished, she set it down and sighed. "Do you think he means it?" "I don't know," Richard admitted. "But it doesn't change what he did." Helen nodded. "Forgiveness isn't for them, it's for us. I forgive him, not because he deserves it, but because I deserve peace." Richard looked at his mother, awed by her strength. "You're an incredible woman, Mom." Helen smiled. "I learned from the best." As the foundation officially launched, Helen and Richard stood together, surrounded by supporters, friends, and women eager to share their stories. The pain of their past had transformed into a mission for justice, a symbol of hope for those in need. The launch event for the New Dawn Foundation was held in a sprawling garden, sunlight streaming through the trees. The crowd was filled with supporters, former victims of abuse now thriving, and local dignitaries eager to celebrate the foundation's mission. At the heart of it all stood Helen and Richard Montero, their bond stronger than ever. Helen stepped up to the podium, her face radiant with pride and purpose. The crowd quieted, their attention fixed on her. "Thank you all for being here," Helen began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "For years, I lived in fear, believing I was powerless. But today, I stand before you as proof that no matter how dark life may seem, there is always hope. The New Dawn Foundation exists to give that hope to others. Together, we can help women reclaim their lives, their dignity, and their strength." The audience erupted into applause as Helen stepped back, her smile warm but humble. Richard approached her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You were incredible," he whispered. Helen squeezed his hand. "I couldn't have done this without you." Later that evening, as the event wound down, Richard and Helen found a quiet moment on the terrace overlooking the city skyline. Helen's eyes glistened as she looked out at the view. "I never imagined life could be like this again," she said softly. Richard handed her a glass of champagne. "You made it happen, Mom. You turned everything they tried to take from you into something beautiful." Helen smiled, her heart full. "And you stood by me every step of the way. I couldn't have asked for a better son." Richard raised his glass. "To new beginnings, and to you, the bravest person I know." The weeks following the launch were a whirlwind of activity. The foundation quickly gained momentum, its reach extending beyond the city. Women from all walks of life began seeking help, sharing their stories, and finding solace in the safe haven that Helen had created. One morning, as Helen prepared breakfast in Richard's penthouse, a letter arrived. It was postmarked from the prison where Elias Vaughn was serving time. Helen stared at the envelope for a long moment before opening it. "Dear Helen, I've had plenty of time to think about what I've done, what I did to you. There's no excuse for the way I treated you. I see that now. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me someday, though I know I don't deserve it. Thank you for being the strong, kind woman that you are. You deserved better than me. I hope you find peace and happiness in this new life you've built. Sincerely, Elias Vaughn." Helen folded the letter and placed it on the counter. When Richard entered the kitchen, she handed it to him. He read it silently, his expression unreadable. "What do you think?" Helen asked. Richard set the letter down. "Do you believe him?" Helen thought for a moment, her fingers brushing the edge of the letter. "I think he's trying to make amends in his own way. But forgiveness, that's not for him. It's for me." Richard nodded. "And do you forgive him?" Helen smiled faintly. "I do. Not for his sake, but for mine. I don't want to carry that anger anymore. It's time to let it go." Richard embraced her, admiration filling his heart. "You're stronger than anyone I know." Months later, Helen and Richard stood in the middle of a bustling new office, the headquarters for the New Dawn Foundation. Desks were filled with employees and volunteers, their enthusiasm infectious as they discussed ways to expand the foundation's programs. "This is just the beginning," Helen said, her eyes shining with determination. "There's so much more we can do." Richard nodded. "And we will. Together." On the one-year anniversary of the foundation's launch, Helen and Richard visited the old family home one last time. It had been sold, the new owners already making renovations. Helen stood in the driveway, staring at the house that had been the source of so much pain and joy. "Are you okay?" Richard asked gently. Helen nodded. "I am. This place was part of my story, but it's not the end. The future is what we make of it." Richard smiled. "And it looks bright." As the sun set that evening, mother and son sat on the terrace of Richard's penthouse, watching the city lights flicker on. Their journey had been one of betrayal, pain, and struggle, but it had also been a story of resilience, love, and redemption. Helen raised her glass, looking at her son with pride. "To us, Richard. To turning pain into purpose." Richard clinked his glass against hers. "To you, Mom. The strongest person I know." And as the night embraced them, they looked ahead with hope, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring, together. If you liked this story and want more content like this, leave a like, share it with someone you know will be moved by it, and of course, subscribe to the channel. Together, we will explore inspiring stories and moments that touch the heart. Until the next video.